Hello everyone, welcome back. This is a bit of a continuation from my previous video. If you haven't watched that, go watch that. It's a bit of a buyer's guide on this old S-Class between 91 to 99. And today we're going to have a look at common issues. Now this isn't going to be an exhaustive list, but this is from personal experience. Having had 3 of them, I've come across a lot of the issues that you're probably likely to also if you're planning on picking one of these up. Okay, let's get into it. Apart from checking the usual things that it drives fine, stops fine, there should be no knocks or noises as you're on the move. This car has the multi-link rear suspension, which was designed for the Mercedes 190e, which was compact saloon from the 80s, 90s, and it can get expensive quite quickly because the multi-link rear suspension has, I think, about 10 arms. So if you're having to replace all of those because they're old and tired, as you can imagine, it can get expensive quite quickly. And talking of suspension, this is a big old car, weighs 2.2 tons, so the suspension does take a beating. Now, you're probably looking at about £100 for each of the front upper arms, which just fit around there somewhere. Springs, you're probably looking at £200 all the way around. Shocks, I think they're between £50 and £100 for each corner, depending on what aftermarket options you go for. I think the Bilsteins are around 100. And then if you've got hydraulic suspension on the rear, you'd probably look at getting that rebuilt rather than forking out for new shocks, which I imagine are probably quite expensive. But you can probably get them rebuilt for a few £100s. So if you were to do the whole suspension, you'd probably need to budget in about £600 to £800. But obviously you can do that over time, as long as things haven't already failed. The 3 big things you should factor into the price when picking one up is the AC evaporator, the engine wiring harness, and obviously the suspension, which I've already mentioned. Oh, and rust, because they all like to do that. I don't know what the hell Mercedes were playing at with their cars being galvanized, but I suspect some disgruntled employee was sabotaging the galvanizing by, I don't know, taking a pee in the chemicals or something. Who knows? But they all like to rust a lot. Anyway, the AC evaporator, that is not a simple job. What it means is it'll be leaking into the cabin, probably just down here. It'll probably leak into the footwell, and to fix it you need to take out the whole dash. And this isn't a, oh yeah, just pull the dash out and you'll be able to fix it relatively easily. I've seen pictures of people trying to do it as a DIY project, and it looks pretty scary and looks like there's a lot involved. Personally, I've had cars apart and I don't think I'd be keen on tackling that. I think it's quoted to be about 18 to 30 hours of labour, so you can imagine at garage prices, that's a pretty big job. The engine wiring harness on the earlier cars, between 91 to 95, basically biodegrade while they're still in the car because of engine heat and age. And what happens is the insulation basically gets brittle and completely falls apart. And after that, you have a massive amount of running issues. Your car might not even work, it'll misfire, it'll randomly cut out, all sorts, because basically you can see all of these cables would need to be replaced as part of that. And obviously every single sensor is hooked up to that loom. To fix that, obviously you'd just have to replace the whole wiring harness from down there somewhere, I think, all the way to the injectors and other sensors here. It didn't look too bad a DIY from what I've seen, but obviously, again, factor that in when you're buying. And I believe the wiring harness itself probably costs about £200 to £300, if I remember right. Another common issue, especially on the 6-cylinder M104, the 280 or the 320, are oil leaks at the front of the engine, where the timing chain cover is actually, and that's not a small job to replace because it involves pulling out a number of things. They also like to leak around the rocker cover gasket and around the oil filter. And the V8s like to kill engine mounts. I've had to do those on the SL, and that was not fun because there's very little access. And I imagine it's the same on a W140. The way you can check that is by opening the bonnet, having the car started, hold your foot on the brake, and just put the car into drive or reverse and just look for the engine moving from side to side. If it's excessive, then those will need doing. Another issue, which I've already touched on, is rust. These cars love to rust. Check all of the arches. You can see here along the edges mine's starting to rust in places. Again there. And the passenger wing is always the worst. The only way to fix that properly is get a new genuine wing, and as you can imagine that's quite expensive. Aftermarket options, it depends what brand you go for. The quality is hit or miss, is what I've been told, especially on how well they fit and whether you preserve proper panel gaps and everything. I'm going to point out other common areas of rust. So rear arches as well. Down here I've seen them starting to rust behind this trim piece. Check the bottoms of each of the doors. So underneath there, all 4 doors I'd check. Along the sills, jacking points I'd have a look at, and even in the boot where the battery is down there, I'd make sure there's no rust down there either. I'd check the inner arches down here. So on the front, make sure you have a good look down there where you can, along these chassis legs. Try have a good look down there as well. The other place they like to rust is behind the front headlights. If there's a little drain at the bottom there somewhere, and if that's blocked, you'll get water sitting and obviously it'll start to rust out. I think that's most of the places you should check. In terms of comfort, generally inside, you'll sometimes hear the blower motor squeaking or the regulator might burn out, and this isn't too serious. I mean, about £100 will get you a new blower motor, and between £50 and £70 will get you a new regulator, and that'll hopefully continue working for another 20 years. If the car has memory seats, make sure that works. There's usually a number and a green button. If you hold the green button and the number together, that saves the position of the seat. And then if you move it around and then obviously press and hold that button again, it should revert to what you've programmed. Another issue you can come across is soft close leaks. So make sure you check all 4 doors and the boot lid as well to ensure the soft close is working on all of them, and make sure a number of times, because if you reset the pump and it has a leak, it'll work for a bit until it realizes, oh, there's a leak there, and then it kind of stops working for all doors. There's a vacuum pump in the boot with a whole number of lines running to it for that system, and as you can imagine, quite difficult to trace where the leak is. So make sure it works. Make sure the central locking works. The central locking pump is quite expensive. I think second-hand ones are between £300 to £400, and when you're searching for second-hand ones, you have to make sure that you have a matching part number, because there's a whole load of variations depending on the options that the car had. And if you were to opt for a new one, I think it was over £1,000 from Mercedes when I checked last. These fail quite often, and when I was breaking one of the cars, it was one of the most common part requests I had. Apparently you can upgrade the motor using a W210 motor instead, so pick up a central locking pump from a W210, take it apart, and you can pull the motor out and put that into the W140 central locking unit instead, which is a good upgrade. All of them came with cruise control, and just check that out. It's just a little stalk above the indicators, which you just flick up to set. If the car has a sunroof, make sure it works. What can happen is the mechanism can get a bit lazy and won't pull down the sunroof panel as far as it should, and as it goes into the roof, it can get scratched along the top, and that means it needs a bit of a service. Both front and rear screens start to delaminate, as you can see here. I don't know whether it's a climate related issue, but every car I've come across here in the UK has had some delamination at least. My rear's actually not too bad. Oh yeah, no, there's some there. A bit of a cosmetic issue is that the rear lights like to get mouldy around the edges, and they always crack around the boot lock as well. So factor that in. If you want a nice new set, they'll be about £200 from a decent aftermarket brand. Now, some problems I've come across personally. The rear door was stuck and it wouldn't open. We luckily managed to pull off the door card from inside by forcing it and bending it a bit. Luckily we didn't damage the door card. I found a little rubber piece which had slipped off the mechanism, and that had basically caused it to jam. I've had the ignition switch stop working randomly, causing the car to cut out while driving, and then you'd leave it sitting a bit and then it'd start again and work fine for a bit before cutting out randomly. I've also had the ignition switch jammed, so obviously I'd put the key in and it wouldn't turn at all. The steering lock was on and it was a bit of a nightmare getting that recovered. But you basically had to cut out the old steering lock and get a whole new one. I've had the blower motor regulator go, as well as the blower motor itself, but I've already mentioned that. Gearbox leaks I've come across. Rear heated screen not working. I've come across that on 2 cars. the comfort control unit was faulty, and that actually meant that the lights would stay on in the car once I'd locked it and stepped away from it, and obviously the battery ended up dying because of that, and temporarily I would disconnect the battery until I got a new one. I've also had to replace the water pump on one of the 6-cylinder ones I had, and I've also had the central locking pump issue again, which I've already mentioned. If you're planning on buying one of these, I would recommend signing up to the Mercedes-Benz Club so you can get access to the parts portal. That gives you the opportunity to search for part numbers on Autodoc, for example, or even on the web to find some cheaper aftermarket alternatives. So in conclusion, check all of the electrics work as they should, that it drives and stops fine, and obviously some of the more specific things I've mentioned. The engine and gearboxes are generally quite good, but it's everything else around it that will start to fall apart, I think, because these were quite complex for the time. These are at that age where people think they are a bargain for what they're getting, and that's true, but they often forget of the costs involved to keep one in decent order. You can quite quickly spend as much as you paid for the car, which is pretty much what I did. If you haven't seen the video for that, go check it out. I do hope you find a decent one. Drop me a note in the comments below on how you're getting on with yours. If you found this video useful, make sure you hit that like button. Thank you for watching, and until next time.